Good evening. I'm your storyteller tonight. You've come here to sleep, haven't you? But sleep doesn't come easy when shadows whisper. Before we begin, do me a favor. Like this video and subscribe so you never listen alone. Now tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it?
And don't forget to subscribe.
I want to know who's awake when the rest
skin.
of the world is dreaming.
Now, turn
Get
off
under the
lights,
covers,
grab your
close your
blanket
eyes,
tight,
and let the darkness
closely.
take over.
Tonight's nightmare begins.
I was walking
Story
home
one.
from a long, exhausting day of work when I caught a glimpse of the paper stapled on an old telephone pole. I took a picture of it thinking it was amusing. I was going to show my wife once I got to our apartment. But I was caught up with chores and forgot about it. Dinner, dishes, laundry, packing a snack for our daughter, putting her to bed, then putting her toys away that she'd left out in the living room. Every night, it was the exact same routine. The next day, I awoke sleeping back to back with my wife. I always had to get up earlier than she did for my job, so I quietly got ready for the day and headed out the door. At work, I was updating the company's latest expense report. Most days were similar to this one. They were basically paying me to stare at a computer for 9 hours a day and input a couple numbers in to a spreadsheet. I finished my work very quickly, so I decided to head out of the office early. It also helped that it was a Friday, and a lot of people leave early at the end of the week. On my walk back, I was thinking of what my life had become. I did this often. I always dreamed of traveling when I was younger. I wanted to drive across the country, a solo backpack, across Europe. Then I met Kelsey. Don't get me wrong, I loved Kelsey. I mean, I still do. We just don't have that spark anymore. When you meet someone and get in a relationship, whether it's meant to be or not, some of your personal life plans have to be put on hold. And then that relationship turns to marriage. And then you have a baby. Then you have to enroll your daughter in preschool. Then you have to get a better paying job and work more hours and blah, blah, blah.
It was perfect.
I'm not trying to throw a pity party for myself. I'm just saying I wasn't exactly content with where I was in my life. I wouldn't have referred to myself as a happy person, as I took the same route home that I did every day to work and back. I walked by the same poster I had passed the day before. I don't know why. I really don't. But I decided to call the number. I figured it would be some joke. Maybe someone just picks up and says, "I love you," on the other end and hangs up. Or maybe it's a line to a sex worker. I had no idea what to expect. I called. It only rang once before someone picked up. "Hello?" a woman said. "Hi. I'm calling about your poster, your ad."
Nothing came.
"Oh,
After
awesome,"
about 5 minutes,
she said calmly.
I convinced myself it was
"When do you want to
probably
pick
just
it
an
up?"
animal. We get
"Pick
deer
what
in
up?"
our yard all the time.
"The jar,"
And maybe one
she
had
said,
wandered onto the driveway.
like it was the most obvious thing in the
I turned
world.
the TV volume back up and tried
Oh,
to focus on the
of
late
course.
night comedy show I'd been watching.
I realized
couldn't
then
shake the
that I had
feeling
left
that
work
something
early
was
without
off.
telling Kelsey, so I
You know
could just
that
go pick it up
primitive
now,
instinct that tells
and
you
she'd
when
be
you're
none the
being
wiser.
watched?
What exactly
I
is
had
it
that feeling,
that
but
you're selling?
amplified to an almost
I just told you,
unbearable level.
it's
I
happiness
got up and went
in a
to the
glass
front
jar,
window,
like
being
the poster
careful
said.
to stay to the side
Happiness
where I
keeps
couldn't be
best in
seen
glass
from
jars.
outside.
They're
I
more
peered
durable
through the
than,
curtains,
say, a
scanning
plastic
the
bag.
driveway and front yard. Nothing looked
okay.
out of place.
Should
Our
we meet
motion
somewhere?
sensor lights hadn't even
For
activated.
sure. I don't
checked
want you
all
to
the
end up being a
doors and
creep or
windows on
something.
the first floor,
So let's go to a
making
public
sure
place.
everything was locked.
The public place
They
we
were.
decided on was a
I set the
Starbucks
alarm
parking lot
system
a
like
little
my
over a
parents
mile
had taught
from me.
me and went to bed,
Now, I
telling
didn't think I was
myself
really
just
going to
being
be buying a
paranoid
jar of
because
happiness
I
or
wasn't
whatever.
used to being alone in
I was
such a big
99%
house.
sure she was going to sell me
Thursday
drugs.
passed normally.
Maybe
I had a
heroin would
job
be in the
interview
jar.
in the morning, met
I
some
remember
friends
thinking,
for lunch, and
oh
spent
no,
the afternoon
happiness
cleaning the house.
is probably a
But as
nickname for
evening
some street
approached,
drug,
I
and I'm
found
going to a
myself
drug deal.
getting anxious again.
What if she's a
I
cop?
kept looking out
Am I going to be
windows,
arrested?
checking the alarm
But something
system,
inside me
and
told me to
jumping
keep
at every
walking,
small
and so I
sound.
did. I
Around
stood
9
outside and
p.m.,
texted
I
her,
was in the
me,
kitchen making dinner
I'm here,
when I heard it
her,
again.
cool,
Footsteps on
be there in
gravel.
a second,
This time,
me,
I was sure they
what are you
weren't
driving,
animal
her,
footsteps. They
silver
had a rhythm,
Camry,
a
and as her
purpose that
final
only
text
human
came through,
movement could have.
I saw her car
I
pull in.
immediately turned
She
off
took a
all the
spot
lights
not
on
too
the
far
first
from
floor
where I
and
stood.
crept to the front
I could see
window.
there was no one
The
else in the
footsteps
car,
had stopped again,
which put my
but now I
kidnapping
could see
fear to
something that
rest.
made my blood
She
run
opened her
cold.
door and
At
stood
the
on
edge
the
of our
pavement,
driveway,
looking
just
around
barely
until her
visible in the
eyes met
dim light
mine.
from the street lamp,
I gave her a
was
little
figure,
nod of
a
acknowledgement.
person
She
standing
simply
perfectly
responded
still,
by waving her hand,
facing our house.
gesturing for
I
me to
couldn't
come
make
over
out
to her
any
car,
details,
so I
height,
did.
gender,
She was young,
clothing,
maybe
because they were
mid-20s,
just outside the
with
range
curly
of
golden
clear
hair.
visibility.
Her skin
But
was
they were
pale and
definitely
contrasted
there.
with the all-black
I
outfit
watched
she was
for at
wearing.
least 10 minutes.
I thought she looked like Glinda the
figure
Good
never
Witch
moved,
from The
never
Wizard of
shifted
Oz
position,
had put on the
just
Wicked
stood
Witch's
there,
clothes.
staring at our house.
Nice day out,
Then,
she
as
said,
suddenly as
as
I
a greeting.
noticed them, they were gone.
Oh, yeah, it is.
I blinked.
Hadn't really paid
and the
attention
spot
to
where
it.
they'd been standing was empty.
You were the one that called
I
about the jar,
police
right?
immediately. I told
Yeah,
them someone was
that was
lurking
me.
around my property,
Cool.
and they said they'd
Well,
send a patrol
here you go.
car to check the
She
area.
handed me a very
The
small
officer
glass mason
arrived
jar.
about 20 minutes later.
It couldn't have been more than
searched our
2 inches
yard and
tall.
the surrounding area
Inside
with
of
a
it was a
flashlight,
light.
and found nothing
Not a light
unusual.
bulb, just
He was
light.
kind, but clearly
It was like
thought I
someone
was a
bottled
young
up
woman,
sunshine.
letting her
It
imagination
glowed
run
even in the
wild.
mid-afternoon
He
daylight.
gave me his card and
It
told
looked
me
like
to
a
call
tiny
if I
sun,
saw anything else,
or a tiny
but I could
universe
tell he
existing in
wasn't
this little
taking it
crystal-walled
seriously.
home.
That night,
I was admiring
barely
it,
slept.
with no
Every
attempt to
sound
hide the
house
awe on
made,
my face.
And old houses make a lot
Pretty
of
rad,
sounds,
isn't it?
Had me sitting
What-
up in bed,
what is it?
straining to listen.
You've
I
asked
kept the
that,
alarm system
like,
on and my
3
phone
different
next to my
times,
pillow.
I think.
Friday started
My answer's
normally
still the
enough.
same.
I had
It is
convinced
happiness.
myself that maybe
Happiness
the
in a
officer
glass
was
jar.
right. Maybe I had
What
just
do I
been
do with it?
spooked by shadows or
Keep
a
it,
neighbor walking
she
their
said
dog.
simply.
I spent
you have
the
any
day
problems,
running
shoot me a
errands and
text.
trying to enjoy my
She started
remaining
to get
week of
into her
freedom.
car.
But
Wait,
Friday night,
I said.
everything escalated.
I thought you were selling this?
I was upstairs in my
How much
bedroom
is it?
around 10 p.m.
Don't
when I heard
worry,
something
man,
that made my
she
heart
said with
stop.
a smile.
The
You'll
front
pay.
doorknob was
She
rattling.
closed her door,
Not like
and I
someone
stepped out of
knocking
her
or
way
ringing the
as she
doorbell,
backed up
but like someone
and
was
drove
gently
off.
testing to see if the door
What the
was
hell had
locked.
just happened?
I grabbed my
What was
phone
I holding?
and crept to my bedroom window.
I looked down at
which
the
gives
jar
a
again.
partial view of
Its
the front
radiance was
porch.
simply
The
mesmerizing.
porch light was on, and
I
I
put
could
it in
see
my
the front
pocket
door clearly.
and could see its glow
No
slightly
one
through
was
my
there,
pants.
but the doorknob
I
was
began to
definitely
walk home.
moving.
What was just a
I
nice
called
sunny day
911 again.
quickly
This
changed
time,
into a
I was
rainy one
crying
with clouds
and could
wrapping the
barely
sky.
get the words out.
It was not
The
forecasted that it
dispatcher
would rain,
kept me on the line
or
while
else
sending
I would have ridden the
officers to my
bus or
location.
subway to work that
She
day.
told me to stay
I
upstairs.
jogged
and away
home
from
trying not to
windows.
get too drenched.
The rattling stopped.
I finally
before
found
the police
shelter once I
arrived.
made it to my
When they
apartment
got
building.
there, they
I
searched
walked
the
up to my
entire
door
property
and
thoroughly.
found that my key
They
wasn't on
found
my
something
key
that
ring anymore.
convinced them I wasn't imagining
Shit.
things.
I can't believe I
Fresh
lost it
footprints
again,
in the flower
I
bed
thought.
under the front windows.
I knocked on the door
Footprints that
and said in a
definitely
somewhat
hadn't
loud
been
voice,
there when I'd watered the
"Hey
plants
babe,
that morning.
it's me.
The officers
I don't know
took
what
pictures
happened to
of
my
the
key."
prints and filed a report.
I heard the door
They
being
also
unlocked
walked
from
through
the other
house
side.
with me,
When the
checking
door
every
opened,
room,
I
every
was
lock,
greeted by a
every
large,
window.
heavy-set
Everything
man
was secure.
with greasy
They
hair
recommended I
and
stay with
unkempt
friends
goatee.
or family
He said,
until my parents returned.
"I think you got
but
the
I
wrong door,
stubbornly
bud."
refused.
"Oh,"
This was my house,
I said,
and I wasn't going to be
disoriented.
driven out of it by some
"My
creep.
bad. Sorry.
Saturday was
Have
when
a good
things
one."
got truly terrifying.
He let out a
I'd
chuckle as he
spent the
closed
day
the
with
door.
friends, deliberately
Apartment
staying
number
out late
33.
so I wouldn't have to be in the house alone.
I know
for
that
very
was
long
my
before
apartment.
bed.
I know
I
it
got
was.
home around midnight,
I'd been in
pulled
apartment
into the
33
garage,
for 5
and
years
locked it
now,
behind me as I
but that was
always
not
did.
my apartment.
As I was walking through the
From what I could
garage
see
toward the door
inside,
that led
all
into
the furniture
kitchen,
was different.
I heard something
It was
that
painted a
froze
different
me in
color.
place.
It was all
It was
wrong.
coming from inside
I
the
felt like
house.
I'd hit my head
A
and was
sound
drugged.
like someone walking
In that
around
moment,
on the first
nothing
floor.
made sense.
Heavy,
I pulled out
slow
my phone to call
footsteps.
Kelsey so she could
Definitely
calm
not
me
the
down
settling
and
of
tell
the
me I
house
just
or
got
any other
confused for a
explanation
second.
I could rationalize.
But her contact wasn't in my phone.
Someone was in my house.
In fact, nothing was in
I
my
stood
phone.
in the garage.
I had no
trembling,
messages with
trying
her.
to figure out
No
what to
previous
do.
calls.
My car
No
keys
pictures.
were still in my hand.
It was like my
I
phone
could get back
reset
in the
to its
car
factory
and drive
settings.
away, but then what?
Did that girl somehow switch
Call
my
the
phone out
police
when I
from
wasn't
somewhere
looking?
else and wait for them to
I would have
arrive
just
while
dialed
this
Kelsey's
person
number
did who knows
manually,
what in my
but I couldn't
house.
quite remember it.
Instead, I did
I had known it
something
by heart
incredibly
before,
stupid.
but not anymore.
I decided to
I needed
listen
to get
more
back to the
carefully
office.
to try to
I had all my
figure out
contacts
exactly
backed
where
up
the
on my
sounds
work
were
computer.
coming from.
Since it
and
was
what
still
this
raining,
person might
I
be
hopped on the
doing.
bus,
I
which
put
had a
my ear
stop
to the
right in
door,
front of the
leading
apartment
from the garage
complex.
to the kitchen.
I rode
The
downtown
footsteps
toward
were
my office,
definitely on the
the
first
whole
floor,
time staring
and
at
they
my
seemed
wet
to be
shoes,
moving in a pattern,
wondering what the hell
like
was
someone
going
was
on.
walking from
We
room
have a
to
key
room,
card access to our
slowly
building,
and
so
methodically.
only
What
authorized
made it even
personnel
more
can get inside.
terrifying was the rhythm.
I always
The
keep my
footsteps
access
weren't
card in my
rushed or
wallet,
frantic like you'd
always.
expect from a
But
burglar regular trying
Surprise,
to get in and out quickly.
surprise,
They were calm,
it wasn't there.
deliberate, like whoever was in
I
there
buzzed into
belonged
the speaker
there,
we had
like
for
they were
guests with
comfortable.
appointments, or employees
I
as
called
a backup
911
in case
for the
anyone
third
lost
time.
or forgot
The
their car.
dispatcher recognized my address immediately.
BZZ.
She told me to
Hey,
stay
this
in
is
the
Tim.
garage and not
I must have
attempt
lost
to
my
enter
car.
the house under
My
any
employee number is...
circumstances.
I
Police
stopped
were
as I
en
drew a
route.
blank.
The footsteps
A voice came
continued
through the
the
speaker.
entire time I
Tim,
was waiting in the garage.
you got cut out.
Just slow,
What's your
steady
employee
walking
number?
from room to room.
I can't
Occasionally,
remember.
they would pause for a few
That's
minutes,
fine.
then start
Just
again.
tell me your full name
When
and
the police
department.
arrived, They found all the doors
finance.
and windows still
I'm in
locked from the
finance.
inside.
My full name is
The
Tim
alarm
Brooks.
system was still
1
armed
second.
and hadn't detected any breach.
About 30 seconds
But
later,
when they entered
the man
house,
spoke to me
they
again.
found clear evidence
We
that
don't have a
someone
Tim
had been
Brooks working in this
inside.
building.
Lights were on.
Did you have an
in rooms
appointment
I
with
knew
someone?
I'd left dark.
I backed up in
Cabinet
surprise,
doors in the kitchen
almost
were
tripping
open.
on my own feet.
Books on the living room
I
shelf
had just
had
been in that
moved
office
around.
an hour or two ago.
Most disturbing of all,
What was happening to
someone
me?
had been sitting on my
I
parents'
felt like
bed.
I was getting
There was a
Alzheimer's,
clear
but
indentation
going
in
through
the
every
comforter.
stage in one
But
day.
whoever had been in the
I
house
stared at
was
my
gone.
hands,
The
unsure
police
if I was in the
searched
right
every
body.
room, every closet,
I felt like the world
basement,
around me
the
was
attic.
disintegrating.
No one was there.
I wasn't in control.
How had someone
I was
gotten
merely sitting
a
inside
locked
somebody
house
else's
with an
head,
armed security
watching the
system?
world through their
How
eyes.
had they left without
Just then,
triggering
I
any
got a
alarms
text.
or alerts?
I recognized the
police
number
were as
immediately.
baffled as I was.
It was that girl.
They dusted for
The one who
fingerprints,
gave
but
me the
found
jar.
nothing conclusive.
I had forgotten all
They
about it
suggested
until I
changing
saw
all
her
the locks
text.
and upgrading
Her.
the security system.
Hey, how's it
Most
going?
importantly,
I
they
looked at my
strongly
phone,
recommended
dumbfounded.
I not stay in the house
It made me
alone
angry she was so
anymore.
nonchalant about
This
this.
time, I listened.
She knew what was going
I
on.
called my aunt, who
She had
lived
done
about
this
an
somehow.
hour away,
Me.
and asked if I could stay with
What the
her
hell
until
did you
my
do to
parents
me?
returned.
Her.
I packed a
The
bag
worst
that
is
night
yet to
and
come.
left, not even
I was
caring about
astronomically
seeming
close
weak
to
or
just chucking my
cowardly
phone
anymore.
as far as I could
But
in
the story
frustration.
doesn't end there. On
I took the
Sunday,
jar out of my
aunt
pocket.
convinced me to go
It
back
looked
to the house
unchanged,
to get more of my
still
things
glowing,
and to
just
check
as
on
bright.
everything. We went together
What the
in
fuck
the middle
did
of the
you do?
afternoon,
I
thinking
yelled at the
surely
jar,
nothing could happen
realizing
in
I
broad
probably
daylight
looked like
with
a
both of
lunatic.
us there.
As I stared
The
at
house
its
looked
glistening
normal
glass,
from the outside.
I realized
We
something.
used my key to get
I didn't
in,
know what my
and
wife's
everything
face
seemed
looked like
fine at
anymore.
first.
I knew
But
her
as we
name.
were gathering my things
Well,
from upstairs,
I know it started
my
with a
aunt
K,
called out to me from
or
the
maybe
hallway.
a C.
Jessica,
I couldn't
you
picture
need
her
to
in my
see
mind.
this.
I
She
knew
was
I had a
standing in
wife.
front of the linen
I knew I
closet,
did.
staring at something
Yes,
inside.
because I had a
When
daughter.
I joined her,
I had
saw
a
what
wife
caught
and a
her
daughter.
attention.
I
All the
just
towels and sheets
couldn't
had been
remember their
removed from the
faces then,
shelves and
or
were
their
neatly
names,
laid out on the
or their
hallway floor,
birthdays,
arranged
or any
in a
memories I
perfect
had with them.
rectangle like
I know
someone
they
had made a
existed.
bed on the floor.
They did
We
exist.
hadn't done that.
I had
and
just
it
seen them that
definitely
morning,
hadn't
right?
been there when the police
I
searched
couldn't
the
remember
house
how
2
she
nights
looked,
before.
or what she
My
smelled
aunt
like.
immediately called the police
What was our
while
first
I took
date?
pictures with my phone.
We had a wedding, right?
I also called the
What
security
about our
company
first
to
kiss?
ask if there had been
Or my
any
daughter?
alerts since
Or
Friday
was it
night.
my son?
There
Maybe I
hadn't
didn't
been.
even have a kid.
According to their system,
But my wife,
no doors
or girlfriend,
or windows had been opened.
she was real.
No motion
I knew
had been
she was.
detected inside the
The
house.
thought was tearing me
The
apart.
police arrived and
I
documented
couldn't see her in my
everything,
head.
but they had no
I
more
couldn't recall a
answers than
single fact
before.
about her.
They
I was
recommended
standing
we change
outside
the
of the same
security
building,
company and
but I was
install
unsure
additional
why I
cameras
was.
throughout the house.
Did I work there?
That's
I
when
must
my
work
aunt
somewhere.
made a suggestion that I
The rain
initially
was
thought
accompanied by a
crazy,
chilly wind
but
now.
ended up being
It was
crucial.
whipping at my face,
She said
making
we
my
should
nose
check
and
if there
cheeks
were any
sting.
hidden spaces in
I
the
wanted to go
house
home.
that we didn't know
I wanted to
about.
be with her.
Places
I wanted to
where
be
someone
warm.
could hide
I wanted
and
to go into
access
a
the
shitty
house
office
without
job that
triggering
kept a
normal
roof over
entry
my
points.
head.
We
I wanted it
contacted a
all.
contractor who
I was soaking
specialized in
wet.
home inspections.
I was miserable.
He came out on
I couldn't
Monday
remember my
and did a
parents
thorough
or my
examination
childhood.
of the entire house,
Did I even have any
looking
friends?
for any
Why was I in the rain?
instruction.
I
What
looked
he
down at
found
my hand.
changed everything.
I was still clutching
In
the
the
jar.
basement, behind a panel
The only
that looked
memory
like
of my
part the
entire
wall,
life
there
I
was
could
a
concretely
small
remember
access tunnel
was that girl
led
giving
to
it
a
to me,
crawl space running
telling me
under
it was
most of the
happiness.
first floor.
It did not bring
The tunnel
happiness.
connected to an
It
old
brought pain.
drain pipe that led
It brought
outside
suffering.
to a drainage ditch
I was more
behind our
miserable in that
property.
moment than I'd
The
ever
pipe
been.
was just large enough
My
for
phone
a person to
buzzed.
crawl through.
Break the jar,
and it had
Tim.
clearly been
I looked
used
at my other
recently.
hand.
There were fresh scuff
With the setting
marks
sun
and
and
even
the rainy
some fabric
sky,
fibers
I
caught on
swear
the rough edges.
the jar glowed
Someone
brighter
had been
than
using
any
this
street
tunnel
light
to
near
get
me.
into our house.
I didn't
They
break it
could
because I was
access our
following her
basement through this
instructions.
pipe,
I
climb
broke
up into
it
the crawl
because I was
space,
angry.
and get into the
I
main
broke it
house
because
through
I
a
was
loose
upset.
floorboard in the
I
laundry
needed a
room.
release.
They'd probably
I raised
been
my
doing it
arm
for
above my
weeks
head
or even
and
months
brought it
without
down
us
with
knowing.
one swift
When I
motion,
lived there with
shattering
my
the
parents,
jar
they
on the
might have only
concrete
come
beneath
in
my
when the
feet.
house was empty
That dark,
during the day.
chilly air
But when I was
accompanying the
alone,
rain
they
spread
got
away
bolder.
like it was the
The
shockwave of
contractor
a
sealed
bomb
the
going
tunnel
off,
permanently,
and I was
and
at
we
the
had
epicenter.
additional security
I
installed
saw the
throughout
warm,
the basement.
yellow light
But the discovery
from inside the
raised
jar
horrifying
spread rapidly
questions.
across the
How
ground
long had
and
this person
ascended
been
to the
coming
sky.
into our house?
It was as
What
if
had
I
they
was
been
watching the
doing
beginnings
while we
of the
slept
universe
upstairs,
being created.
unaware?
Like God had
Had
just
they been
snapped his
watching
fingers
us,
and said,
learning our
"Let there be
routines?
light."
When my
I was
parents
engulfed
returned
in
from
it.
Europe,
I
told
could
them
no longer
everything.
see street or
They were
rain
horrified
or anything
and
dark.
immediately hired a
I
private
felt like I was
security
plummeting
company
into a
to
star
do a
going
complete
faster than the
assessment
speed of
our
light.
property.
It felt like sitting in front of a fire on a cold
motion
winter's night,
sensors in every room,
but that warmth
and
was
even
covering
got a
every
guard
inch of my
dog.
body. And then
But
I
never
blinked.
felt safe in that house
Immediately,
again.
I could
Every
feel the sheets
sound,
beneath me,
every shadow
and
made
my
me
back barely
paranoid.
touching my
I
wife's.
moved out within 2
I was
months
staring
and
out the
have
window.
never spent another
The
night
morning
there
light
alone.
drenched through the glass
Here's the part that
and
still
gleamed
keeps
on
me
my
awake
face.
sometimes.
I stood
The
from
police
bed and
never
grabbed my
caught
phone.
whoever was doing this.
It was Friday morning.
After we sealed the
I had one
tunnel,
text.
The incident stopped.
Let me know
but
if
that
you ever
person
need
is
another
still out
job.
there.
I called
They
in
know where
sick
I
to
grew
work,
up. They know the
I
layout
snuck
of
into my daughter's
family's
room
house.
and greeted
They
her
know
with a
far
kiss
too much about
and
our
told her
lives.
she didn't have to go to preschool today.
Sometimes I wonder if
We were
they've
going to have a
found
family
another way
day.
in.
She smiled
Or if they've
and stretched
moved
out
on
her
to
arms with a
terrorizing
yawn
some other
before
family.
curling up
I think
and
about
falling
other
back
people
asleep.
who might be
I got back in
experiencing
bed and
strange
squeezed my
sounds
wife
in their
tightly.
houses,
I
footsteps
didn't let
they
go
can't
for hours.
explain.
Our
The
daughter
feeling
came
of
into our
being
room
watched.
and woke us up eventually.
I've learned that there are
She was
people
jumping
out
on the
there
bed
who
and
get
shouting
some
for
kind
us
of
to wake
thrill
up.
from invading others'
Yesterday, I may have
privacy
found
and
that
space.
annoying.
They're not
Yesterday, I may have
necessarily
found a
there
lot
to
of things
steal or to
annoying,
harm.
or
They
monotonous,
just want
or
to be
dull.
where they don't belong.
But not today.
To have access
Today,
to lives that
I
aren't
pulled her under the
theirs.
covers in
The
between me and
violation I
Kelsey.
felt was unlike
Today
anything I'd
was
ever
going to be a good day.
experienced. It
Today,
wasn't just that
I
someone
was
had been
happy.
in our house. It was that they'd been living alongside
I don't
us
know
in
when you're
secret.
going to watch
They'd
this,
been close enough
but
to
I can
watch
tell you
us,
when it started.
to learn our habits,
I was out
to
for a
know
walk
when
alone
we
in the
were
woods
vulnerable.
when the entity
Since
came
then,
for me.
I've never taken home
It was beyond a
security
blur.
for granted.
It
I
was,
always check
for lack of a
hidden
better
access
term,
points when I move
absence of
somewhere
meaning.
new. I
Where
have
it hid,
multiple security
there were no
systems,
trees.
cameras,
Where it crept
alarms.
closer, there was
Some
no
people
grass.
think I'm paranoid,
Through the arc,
but I know
it
what
leapt
it
me.
feels like to discover
There was
that
no
your
breeze
safe
of motion.
space isn't safe
There was no air at all.
I still
As it
live
struck,
in the same city,
I
but
felt
I've
the
never
distinct
felt
sensation of
completely
claws
secure since
puncturing
that
me
experience.
somewhere unseen.
In crowded places,
Somewhere I'd
I
never felt
sometimes think
before.
I see a familiar
My hands
shadow,
and arms, and
someone
legs,
who seems
and
to be
torso
watching
seemed
me.
fine.
It's probably
And I wasn't
just
bleeding,
paranoia, but
but
once
I knew
you've
I'd been
through
injured
something
somehow.
like this, you never really
As I
feel
fearfully
safe
ran back
again.
home,
The worst
I
part
could tell
is
that
not
I was
knowing
less.
who it was or why
I was
they
vaguely
chose our
tired,
house.
and it was
Was
hard
it
to
random,
focus at times.
or had they been watching our
The
family
solution
for
at
some
that early
specific
stage was
reason?
easy.
Were they
A
someone
big
we
cup of
knew,
coffee
or a
helped me
complete
feel normal
stranger
again.
who'd somehow
For a
become
while,
obsessed with our
that
lives?
subtle drain on my spirit
I'll
became
never
lost
have
in
those
the ebb and
answers,
flow of
but I
caffeine
learned
in my
that the
system.
monsters we worry about
You could say
aren't
my life
always
began
the
that
ones
week,
that break
actually,
down doors
because that
or
was when I
shatter
met Mom.
windows.
She and I
Sometimes
got
they're the
along
ones who
great,
find ways to
though,
slip
to be
into
honest,
your life without
I'm
you
pretty
ever
sure I fell
knowing
in
they're
love with her
there.
over the phone before we
Sometimes the
even
most
met.
terrifying
It was
thing
almost as if
isn't
the
what
strong
happens
emotions
to
of
you.
that first
It's
week
what could
made the
have
entity
happened,
fight
what
back.
might have been happening
It was
all
still with
along
me,
without your knowledge.
latched on to some
The idea
invisible
that your
part of my
privacy,
being.
your
The
safety,
first few
your
incidents were
home
minor,
could be
and I
violated
hardly
in ways
worried
you
about
never
them.
even considered.
The color of a
That
neighbor's
2-week
car
period
changed
when I
from
was
dark
home
blue
alone
to black one
changed
morning,
my entire
and I stared at it
perspective on
before
personal
shaking my
security
head
and
and
safety.
shrugging off the
I
difference.
realized how vulnerable
2 days
we
later,
all are,
at work,
how easy
a
it can
coworker's
be for
name
someone with
changed
bad
from Fred to
intentions
Dan.
to access our
I
lives
carefully
if
asked
they're
around,
patient and
but
clever
everyone
enough.
said his name had
I'm
always
sharing
been
this
Dan.
story because I
I
want
figured
people
I'd
to be
just been
aware that
mistaken.
these things can
Then,
happen.
as
That
ridiculous as this
sometimes the bump
sounds,
in the night
I was
isn't
peeing
just
in
the
my
house
bathroom
settling,
at home
and the
when I
feeling of
suddenly
being
found
watched
myself on a
isn't
random
just
street.
paranoia.
I was still in
Sometimes
my
trusting your
pajamas,
instincts
pants
can
down,
literally
and
save your
urinating.
life.
But now,
If you ever
in
feel
full
like
view
something isn't
of
right
a
in
dozen
your
people
home,
at a bus
don't
stop.
dismiss it.
Horrified,
Check for things
I pulled
you
up
might
my
not have
clothes and
considered.
ran before
Old
someone
access
called the
points,
cops.
crawl spaces,
I did manage to
anywhere
get home,
someone could hide
but the
or gain
experience
entry
forced me
without
to admit
using
that I was
obvious
still in danger.
entrances. And if
The
you ever
entity was
find
doing
yourself
something to
home
me,
alone for
and I
extended
didn't understand
periods,
how to fight back.
be extra
Mar
vigilant.
showed up that
Have a
evening,
plan for
but she had her own key.
emergencies. Stay in touch
Hey,
with friends and
I
family.
asked her with confusion.
And never ignore signs
How'd
that
you get a
someone
key?
might be where
She
they
just
should be.
laughed.
I
You're
was
cute.
lucky. Whoever
you
was
sure you're
invading
okay
our
with
house
this?
never escalated to
She opened the
actual
door and entered a
confrontation
room
or
full of
violence.
boxes.
But I know that
I know
not
living
everyone
together
who
is a
goes
big
through
step,
something like this
especially
is
when
so
we've only
fortunate.
been dating 3
The
months.
experience taught
Living
me that
together,
being alone doesn't
I'd
just
literally
mean
just
being by
met her the
yourself.
week before.
It means being responsible
Thing
for
was,
your own safety
my mother
in
had
ways
always
you
called
might
me a
never
smart
have
cookie for a
considered.
reason.
It means
I
being
knew when to
aware
shut
of
my yap.
threats you hoping you'll
Instead of
never
causing a
have to
scene,
face.
I told her
3
everything
years
was
later,
fine.
I still think
Then I
about
went
that
straight to my
person
room
sometimes,
and began
where they are
investigating.
now,
My
whether
things
they
were
ever
just as
found
I had
another
left
way
them,
into
with no
houses
sign
like
of a
mine,
3-month gap in
whether they
habitation.
ever graduated
But
from
I did
secret
find something
invasion
out of the
to
ordinary.
something worse.
The date.
I hope they've moved on
I
to
shivered
less
angrily as I
harmful
processed the
obsessions,
truth.
but I also hope that
The
by
entity had
sharing
eaten
this
3
story,
months of my life.
I can help other
What the
people
hell was I
recognize the
facing?
signs of this kind of
What kind of
violation
creature could
before
consume
it goes
pieces
as
of
far
one's
as it
soul
did
like
for
that?
me.
I'd
Your
missed the
home
most
should be
exciting
your
part of a new
sanctuary. When
relationship,
that safety is
and I would never
compromised,
understand
it
any
changes
shared
you in
stories or
ways
in-jokes
last
from that
long
period.
after the immediate threat is gone.
Something absurdly
But
precious had
surviving
been taken
something
from
like
me,
this
and I was
also makes
furious.
you stronger,
That fury
more aware,
helped suppress
more
the
prepared
entity.
to protect yourself and the
I never
people you
imbibed
care about.
alcohol. I drank
I'm not
coffee
the same
religiously.
trusting person I
I
was
checked the
before
date
this
every
happened.
time I woke up.
That's both a loss
For 3
and a
years,
gain.
I managed to
I've
live
lost
each
some
day
innocence and
while
peace of
observing
mind,
nothing more
but
than
I've
minor
gained skills
alterations.
and awareness that
A
will
social
keep me
fact
safer
here and
for
there.
the rest of my life.
Someone's job.
If you take anything
How many
from this
kids
story,
they had.
let it be
That
this.
sort of thing. The
Trust your
layout of
instincts.
nearby streets.
Secure your home
The time my
thoroughly,
favorite
and
television
never
show
assume
aired.
that being careful
That kind of
is
thing.
being paranoid.
Always,
Sometimes the
those
things
changes
we're afraid
reminded
of
me
are
the creature
exactly
still
the
had its
things we should
claws
be
sunk in
afraid
my
of.
spirit.
And sometimes,
Not once
when
in
you're
3
home
years
alone,
did I ever
you
let
really
myself
aren't
zone
alone
out.
at all.
One day, I grew careless. I let
Hey
myself
everyone,
get really
what I'm
into the
about to
season
share with you
finale of
happened
my
about
favorite
4
show.
years ago when I
It was
working
gripping,
night shifts at
a
Mountain View
fantastic
Hospital.
story.
I've been
Right
hesitating
at the
to
height of
talk
the
about
action,
this for a
a
long
young
time
boy came
because,
up to my lounger
honestly,
and shook my
I
arm.
still can't explain
Surprised,
what
I
happened that
asked,
night, and part of me still
"Who are you?
doesn't want to believe it was real.
How did you get in here?"
Before I get into it,
He
I should
laughed and
mention
smiled
that I've
brightly.
changed some names
Silly
and specific
daddy.
details to
My heart
protect
sank in my
privacy.
chest.
But everything I'm about
I knew
to tell
immediately
you
what
is
had
exactly
happened.
how I remember it
After a
happened.
few masked questions,
I started
I
working
discovered
as a
that he was
nursing
2 years
assistant
old,
at Mountain View in 2018.
and that he was my son.
The hospital
The agony
was
and
pretty
heartache
old,
filling my
built in the
chest
70s,
was nearly
and was
unbearable.
this massive concrete
Not only
structure
had I
with
missed the
5
birth of my
floors.
son,
Some wings
I
had
would
been
never see or
renovated,
know the
but
first
east
years of
wing
his
the
life.
fourth floor, where I usually
Mar and I
worked,
had
was
obviously
still
gotten
original.
married and started a
It
family
definitely
in the
showed
time
its
I'd
age.
lost.
After
And I
about
had
a
no
year
idea
there,
what joys
I
or
switched
pains
to the
those
night
years
shift.
contained.
The pay was
It was
better,
snowing
and I was
outside.
taking classes during the day,
Holding my
so it
son
made
in my
sense.
lap,
Night
I
shifts
sat
ran from
and
11
watched the
p.m.
flakes
to 7
fall
a.m.,
outside.
and I was usually assigned
What kind
to
of
monitor
life
8 to
was
10
this going to be
patients.
if
Most
slips
nights
in
were pretty
concentration
quiet.
could cost
You
me
do your
years?
rounds every couple hours,
I had to get help.
help patients who call,
The church had
and
no
handle
idea
any
what to do.
emergencies.
The
But
priest
mostly
didn't
it was
believe me
just
and
quiet,
told me I had a health
almost
issue
too quiet
rather than
sometimes.
some sort of possession.
That's when your mind starts
The
playing
doctors
tricks
didn't
on
have
you,
any clue.
or at least that's what I
Nothing
used
showed
to
up
think.
on all their
The
scans
night
and
everything
tests,
happened was in late
but they
November.
happily took my
It
money
was
in
one of
return
those
for nothing.
cold, rainy
By the time I
nights
ran
where
out
the
of
water
options,
hits the
I
windows
decided
so
to tell
hard,
Marge.
it sounds like
There was no
someone's
way to
throwing
know what
pebbles
this all
at the
looked like
glass.
from her side.
I remember the weather.
What was I like when I wasn't
specifically
there?
because we had 3
Did I
callings
still
that
take our
night.
son to school?
People didn't want to
Did I
drive
still
in the
do my
storm,
job?
I guess.
Clearly I did,
So we were
because she seemed to be none the
seriously
wiser. But I still
There
had
were
a
just
horrible
2
feeling that
nurses
something
and me
must have been
covering the
missing in her
entire
life
east wing,
when I wasn't
about
actually
30
home
patients.
inside my own head.
My supervisor,
But the night I
Linda,
set
was
up a nice
apologetic
dinner in
but firm.
preparation, she
Just
arrived,
prioritize.
not by unlocking the front
Emergency
door,
calls
but by
first,
knocking
then
on it.
comfort care.
I answered
If you're
and
overwhelmed,
found that she was in a
call
nice
for
dress.
backup.
She was happily
The first few
surprised
hours
by the
were
settings on the
chaotic.
table.
Call lights going
fancy
off
dinner
every
for a
few
second
minutes.
date?
Medications
I
to
knew you were
distribute.
sweet on me.
Patients needing help.
Thank
to
the Lord I
bathroom.
knew when to keep my
By
mouth
2
shut.
a.m., things had
If I'd gone on
finally
about
settled
being married and
down.
having a
Most
son,
patients were asleep,
she might have
and
run
I
for the
finally
hills.
had a moment to breathe.
Instead,
I was
I
at
took
the
her
nurse's
coat
station
and sat
updating
down
some
for our
charts
second date.
when I heard a call
Through
from
carefully
room
crafted
432.
questions, I managed to
Mrs.
deduce the
Peterson,
truth.
an elderly woman
This really
recovering
was
from
our
hip
second
surgery,
date.
needed help
She
to
saw
the
relief
bathroom.
and happiness in me, and
Routine
interpreted
stuff.
that as dating
When I got
jitters.
to room 432,
I was just excited to
Mrs.
realize
Peterson was
that the
fast
entity
asleep.
wasn't
Her
necessarily
call
eating
button
whole
was still in
portions
its
of my
holder on
life.
the wall,
The
definitely not
symptoms,
pressed.
as I was
I
beginning
checked
to
her vitals
understand
just
them,
to be safe.
were more like the
All
consequences of a shattered soul.
Figuring it was a system glitch,
The creature
I
had
went back
wounded
to
me,
the nurse's station.
broken me into
As soon as
pieces.
I sat down,
Perhaps
the
I was to
call
live
light
my
for
life
room
out of order,
432 went
but
off
at least
again.
I would actually get to live it.
Annoyed,
And
thinking
so
it
it
was
went
a
for a few
wiring
years,
issue, I went back
from my
to check.
perspective.
Again, Mrs.
While minor
Peterson
changes
was
in
sound
politics
asleep.
or
This
geography
time I
would happen
inspected the
daily,
call button more
major
carefully.
shifts in my mental
Everything
location
seemed
only
normal.
happened every couple months.
I was about to leave when I
When I
noticed
found
it was
myself in a new
unusually
place
cold
and
in
time
the
in my
room.
life,
The AC
I just
was
shut up
definitely
and
blasting
listened,
harder than it should
making
have been.
sure to get the
I
lay of the
adjusted
land
the thermostat
before doing
and made
anything
a
to
mental
avoid
note
making
to tell
mistakes.
maintenance about both issues
On the
in
farthest
morning.
flung leap yet, I
That's
met
when
my
I heard what
6-year-old
sounded
grandson,
like whispers coming
and I
from the
asked him
bathroom.
what he wanted to be when he
Thinking
grew up.
maybe another
He said,
staff member was
writer.
in there. I knocked on the
I told him
bathroom
that was a
door.
fine idea.
No answer.
Then, I was back
The
in month
whispers
2 of my
stopped.
relationship
I
with
opened
Mom,
the door.
and I had the
Empty.
best night with
Just
her
an
on the
ordinary
riverfront.
hospital bathroom.
When I say the
remember
best,
standing there
I
for
mean
a
the
minute,
best.
wondering if I was
Knowing how
just
special she would
overtired.
become to me,
The bathroom
I
was
asked her
ice
to move
cold,
in.
even colder
I got
than
to
the
live
room.
through what I'd
I
missed the
closed
first
door
go
and
round,
left,
and
telling
I came to
myself it
understand
was
that
just
I was
the
never
ventilation
mentally
system
absent.
making weird
I would always
noises.
be there,
Around
eventually.
3 a.m., I was doing
When
my
we were
rounds
moving her
again
boxes
when I
in,
noticed something
she
odd.
stopped for a moment
According
and
to
said
my
she
charts,
marveled at my
room
great love,
438
as if
should
I'd
have
known
had
her
a
for a
patient,
lifetime and never
a
once
middle-aged
doubted she
man
was the
named
one.
David White,
That was the
who'd
first
been
time I
admitted that
truly
afternoon
laughed
with
freely and
pneumonia.
wholeheartedly
But when I got
since
to
the entity had
438,
wounded immediately.
The room was completely
She was
empty.
right about my
The
love
bed
for
was
her,
made,
but
looking
for exactly the
untouched.
reason she
I
considered
double-checked
a
my
silly
notes,
romantic
thinking I'd
analogy.
made a mistake.
I had known her my
No,
whole life,
David White was
and I'd come to
definitely
terms with my
supposed to be in
situation and found peace with
438.
it. It wasn't
went
so
to
bad
find
to have
Linda to
sneak
ask
peeks
about
at
it.
all the best parts ahead.
That's strange,
But of course,
she said,
I wouldn't be
looking at the
writing this
computer.
if it hadn't gotten
System
worse.
shows he's still admitted
The entity was
and
still
in
with
that
me.
room.
It had not wounded
Maybe
me
they moved
and
him for a
departed like I'd
procedure
wanted
and
to
forgot
believe.
to update.
The closest
We
I can
checked with the
describe
other
my growing
floors.
understanding was
No
that the
one
creature
had
was burrowing
Mr. White.
deeper into my psyche,
Linda called
fracturing
the ER
it
to see
into
if he'd
smaller
been transferred
pieces.
back down, but they
Instead of
hadn't
months
seen him.
between major shifts,
She started to
I began
look
having
worried.
only weeks.
Let me check his
Once I
file
noticed
again,
that trend,
she said.
I
Maybe
feared my
there's something
ultimate
in
fate
his admission notes.
would be to jump between times
While
in my
Linda
life,
was looking into it, I went
heartbeat
back to
by
continue
heartbeat,
my rounds.
forever confused,
As I walked past
forever
room
lost.
432,
Only
Mrs.
an
Peterson's
instant in
room,
each time
I heard what
meant I
sounded
would
like
never
a
be
man's
able to
voice
speak
coming
with
from
anyone else.
inside.
never
thinking
be
a
able to
family
hold a
member might have
conversation,
somehow snuck in
never
after
express
visiting
or
hours,
receive love.
I quietly
As the true
opened the
depth
door
of
to
that
check.
fear came upon me,
Mrs. Peterson
I
was
sat
still
in an
asleep.
older version
No
of
one
me
else
and
was
watched the
visible
snow
in the room.
falling outside.
But I distinctly heard
That
a
was
man
the one
say,
constant
"They
in my
took me
life.
to the old room."
The weather didn't care
felt
who
the
I
hair on
was
my arms
or what
stand
pains
up.
I had to
The
face.
voice seemed to come from
Nature was
everywhere
always
and
there.
nowhere at once.
The falling snow
I
was always
quickly
like a
checked
little
the
hook
bathroom.
that kept me in a
Empty.
place.
Under the bed,
The
nothing.
pure emotional peace it
I
brought
even
was like
looked
a
in the
panacea
closet.
on my
When
mental
I turned
wounds,
back toward Mrs.
and I'd never
Peterson,
yet shifted
I
while
noticed
watching
her
the
call
pattern of
button was
falling
now
white
on the floor.
and thinking of
I'm
the times
certain it
I'd
was
gone
in the
sledding
holder
or
when
built
I
a
first
snow
came
fort
in.
as a child.
After
A
finishing
teenager
my
touched my arm.
rounds, I found Linda
Grandpa?
still trying to track down
Eh?
Mr. White.
It startled
She
me
looked
out of my
frustrated.
thoughts,
"This
so I was
makes
less
no
careful
sense,"
than usual.
she said. He was
"Who are
definitely
you?"
admitted.
He
Dr.
half
Sharma
grinned,
saw him at 4
as if not
p.m.
sure whether I
yesterday.
was joking.
Respiratory did a treatment at
Handing me a
6.
stack of
Then,
papers,
nothing.
he said,
"No more notes."
"It's my first attempt
This
at
is
a
going
novel.
to sound weird.
Would you read
I
it
said,
and tell me
but
what you
when
think?"
I was in Mrs. Peterson's
Ah,
room,
of
I heard
course.
a man's voice say,
Pursuing
"They
that
took
dream
me to
of
the
being a
old
writer,
room."
I see.
Linda
He
gave
burned
me a
bright
strange
red.
look.
Trying to,
What old
anyway.
room?
All
That's when
right.
I remembered something.
Run off. I'll read this
During
right now.
my orientation,
The words
one
were
of the
blurry,
older nurses had
and,
mentioned that
annoyed,
before the last
I
partial
looked for
renovation,
glasses I probably
the
had
east
for
wing
reading.
had a different room
Being
numbering
old was
system.
terrible,
What
and I
was
wanted
now
to
the
leap back
storage
into a
closet
younger
at the
year,
end of the hall used
but
to
not
be a
before I read his
patient
book.
room
I
440.
found my glasses in a sweater
Do you think
pocket
he could be talking
and
about
began
the
leafing
old
through.
room 440? I
Mar
asked.
puttered in and out of the living
Linda
room,
shook her head.
still beautiful,
That's been a storage
but I had to
closet for
focus.
years. It
I
doesn't
didn't know
even
how
have a
much
bed
time I would
anymore.
have there.
Still,
It seemed that we
something
had
told me I
relatives
needed
over.
to check.
Was it Christmas?
I'm going to take a look anyway,
A pair of
I
adults
said.
and a couple
The
kids I
storage
didn't
closet
recognize
was at the very
tromped
end of
through
the
the
hall,
hallway,
past all
and
the
I saw my
patient
son,
rooms. It
now
was
adult,
rarely used because
walk
it
by
was so
with his
far
wife
from the
on the
nurse's
way out the
station.
door.
As I approached,
As a group,
I
the
noticed the
extended
door was
family
slightly
began
ajar,
sledding outside.
which was unusual since
Finally,
it was normally
I
kept
finished
locked.
reading the story,
I pushed the
and
door
I called
open.
out for my
The room
grandson.
was dark, with
He
just a
rushed down the
sliver of
stairs
light
and into
coming
the
in from
living
the
room.
hallway. I felt
was
around
it?
for the light switch and flipped
Well,
it on.
it's
It
terrible,
wasn't a storage
I told him
closet
truthfully.
anymore. It was a fully
But it's
set-up
terrible for all
patient
the
room.
right reasons.
I stood
You're
frozen
still a
in the
young man,
doorway,
so
where
your
there should have been
characters behave
shelves
like
of
young people.
supplies and equipment.
But the structure
There was
of the
a
story
hospital
itself
bed
is
with
very
monitors.
solid.
The room
I
looked
paused.
off somehow.
I didn't expect it to
machines
turn
were
out to be a
older
horror
models
story.
we didn't use
He
anymore.
nodded.
The paint on
It's
the
a
walls
reflection
was
of the
a faded
times.
green color
Expectations
that
for
the
the
hospital
future
had
are
replaced
dismal,
years ago.
not
And there,
hopeful,
in the
like
bed,
they used to be.
was a man who matched the description.
You're far
of
too
David
young
White.
to be aware like that, I told him.
approached him slowly.
An idea occurred to
Mr.
me.
White? I asked.
If you're into horror,
David?
do you know anything about
He
strange
turned
creatures?
toward me, but something
Sure.
wasn't right.
I read everything I
His
can.
movements were
I love
jerky,
it. Warily,
unnatural.
I scanned the
His
entrances
eyes
to the
looked
living
glazed
room.
over. They
Everyone
said
was
this
busy
my room
outside.
now, he said
For
in
the
a
first
flat
time,
voice.
I opened
Said
up
I
to
needed
someone
to
in my
be
life
isolated.
about what I was experiencing.
Who said that? I
In
asked,
hushed
my
tones,
voice barely
I
above
told
a
him
whisper.
about my fragmented
The doctor
consciousness.
with the black eyes.
For a teenager,
he replied.
he took it well.
I felt a chill run
You're
down
serious?
my spine.
Yes.
I needed to get
He
help.
donned the
I
determined
turned
look
to go
of a
find
grown
Linda,
man
but as I
accepting a
reached for the
quest.
door, it slammed shut.
I'll look into it.
I tried
See
the
what I
handle.
can find out.
Locked. I started
You should
pounding
start
on the
writing
door
down
and
everything
shouting
you
for help.
experience.
Behind
Build
me,
some
I
data.
heard Mr. White say in
Maybe
that
we can
same
map your
flat
psychic
voice,
wound.
They don't like
Wow.
it when you try to leave.
Sounds like a plan.
The lights began
I was
to flicker.
surprised. That
In
made
the
sense,
brief moments of
but I hadn't
darkness,
expected
I thought
him to
I
have a
saw
serious
other figures
response.
in the room.
But how will I get all the
Shadowy
notes in
forms
one
standing
place?
corners. Between my pounding and
Let's
yelling,
come up with somewhere
I heard
for you to leave
footsteps
them,
in the
he
hallway.
said,
The door
frowning
suddenly
with thought.
opened, and Linda stood
Then
there,
I'll get them,
looking confused.
and we can trace the path you're
What are
taking
you
through
doing?
your own life.
She asked.
See if there's a pattern.
Why are you making so much
For the first
noise?
time since the situation had
I
gotten
turned
worse,
to point at Mr.
I felt
White,
hope again.
But the room was now just a
How about
storage
under the
closet
stairs?
again.
Nobody
Shelves
ever
of
goes under there.
supplies, Cleaning equipment.
Sure.
No bed. No
He turned
patient.
and left the living room.
He was here.
I peered after
stammered.
him.
David White
I heard
was
him
just
banging
here.
around near the
The
stairs.
room was different.
Finally,
it was set up
he
like
returned with a
patient
box,
room. Linda
laid it on the
looked
carpet,
concerned.
and opened it to
Maybe
reveal
you
a
should take
bursting
a break,
stack of
she
papers.
said gently.
He exclaimed,
It's been a
"Holy
stressful
crap.
night. night.
But of course,
I knew what I'd
being a
seen,
teenager,
but I also
he
knew
didn't
how
really
it
say
sounded.
crap.
I
Taken aback,
reluctantly agreed to
I
go
blinked
to the break
rapidly,
room for a few
forgiving
minutes.
his cussing because of the
During
shock.
my break, I
Did
couldn't
I write
shake
those?
what I'd seen.
He looked up at me with
It
wonder.
felt too real to
Yeah,
be a hallucination.
Or, you will.
I decided to
You
do
still
some
have to
digging.
write them and
The
put them under the
hospital
stairs
had a small
after this.
archive room near
He
administration
gazed back down
where
at the
they kept
papers,
older
then
records.
covered the box.
I'd been in there once
So you
before
probably
to
shouldn't
find
see
some
what they say.
paperwork, so I
That
knew
could
the
get
code
weird.
to get in. I
That
shouldn't
much I
have been
understood.
leaving my post, but
Right.
I had to know
He
if there was
gulped.
something about room
There are like
440.
50 boxes under
In
there,
the archive
all
room,
filled up
I
like
found
this.
records organized
Deciphering
by
these
year.
will take a very
I
long
went back
time.
to the 1970s
His
when
tone
the
dropped to
hospital was
deadly
first built.
seriousness.
After
But
some
I will
searching,
save you, Grandpa,
I found a floor plan
because I don't
from
think anyone else can.
1978.
Tears
Sure
flowed
enough,
down my
what
cheeks
was now
then,
the storage closet
and I couldn't
was
help but
originally
sob
room
once or twice.
440. I dug
I hadn't
deeper
realized
and
how
found
lonely I'd
patient
become in my
records from
shifting
that
prison
era.
of awareness
In 1979,
until I finally had
there
someone
were
who
several
understood.
incident reports filed about
Thank
room
you.
440.
Thank you so
Patients
much.
reported seeing
And then I was
people
young
in the
again,
corners
and at
hearing
work
whispers.
on a random
One
Tuesday.
patient claimed a
Once
doctor
the sadness
with black
and relief
eyes
faded,
visited them in the
anger
night,
and
but
determination
no doctor
replaced
was on
them.
record as having been there.
After I finished my
The
work,
most disturbing
I grabbed some
report was
paper
from a
and began
nurse who
writing.
documented that a patient
While the weeks
assigned
shifted
to
around
room
me,
440
while those
had
weeks
gone
became
missing
days,
for 12
and then
hours.
hours,
When they
I
found
wrote
him,
every
he
single
was
spare moment
disoriented and
about
kept
when
saying
and
he'd
where I
been
thought I
in the
was.
old hospital.
I put them under
After
the
that
stairs
incident,
out of order.
room 440
My first box
converted
was
to
actually the
storage,
30th,
and the room
and my last
numbering in
box
that
was the
section
first.
was changed.
Once,
As I was
I
putting
had
the
over
files
50
back,
boxes
I noticed
written
a
from
black
my
and white
perspective.
staff photo from
And once my shifting
1979.
became a matter of minutes,
I recognized the
I knew it
building,
was up to
the
my grandson to
uniforms,
take it
but
from
not
there.
the people,
I put my head
except
down
one.
and stopped looking.
Standing in the
I
back
couldn't stand
row
the
was a
river of
doctor
changing
I'd never
awareness
seen
any
before,
longer.
but who looked oddly
Names
familiar.
and places and dates
According
and
to the
jobs and
caption,
colors.
his name
And
was
people were
Dr.
all wrong and
Everett
different.
Marsh.
I'd never
I took
been
a
older.
picture of the photo with my
I
phone
sat
and
watching
left
the
the
snowfall.
archive room, my
A
mind
man of at least
racing.
30 that I
When I
vaguely
got back to the
recognized
nurse's
entered the
station,
room.
Linda was on the
Come
phone
on.
looking
I
stressed.
think I finally figured it
He's
out.
back, she said
I
as
was
she
so
hung up.
frail that moving was
David
painful.
White.
Are
They
you
found
him?
him in the MRI
Are you my
room in the
grandson?
basement. He has no idea how
Yes.
he got there.
He
Last
took
thing
me
he
to a room
remembers
filled
is
with
being in
strange
his room
equipment
around 10
and sat
p.m.
me in a rubber chair facing
he
a large
okay?
mirror
I
twice the
asked.
height of a man.
Physically, yes,
pattern
but he's
finally
agitated,
revealed
talking
itself.
nonsense. Keeps
How long have you
mentioning a
worked
doctor
on
who
this?
visited
I
him,
asked
a
him,
doctor not
aghast.
on our staff.
Tell me you didn't miss
Did
your
you say
life
the
like I'm
doctor
missing
had black
mine.
eyes? I asked
His
quietly.
expression was both stone cold
Linda's
and
expression
furiously
changed.
resolute.
How did you
It'll
know
be
that?
worth it.
I
He
showed
brought
her the
two
picture
thin
I'd
metal
taken
rods
of the
close
old
to my
staff
arm
photo.
and then nodded at the
I
mirror.
think he might be talking
Look,
about this doctor.
this shock is
Dr.
carefully
Everett
calibrated.
Marsh.
The
Linda
electric
studied the
zap
photo.
from his device
That's
was
impossible.
startling,
This
but not
picture is
painful.
from, what,
In the mirror,
70s?
I saw a rapid
That doctor
arcing light
would be
silhouette
retired or
appear
dead
above
by
my
now.
head and shoulder.
I know,
The electricity
I said,
moved through
but I
the
found some
creature
old
like a
incident
wave,
reports about
briefly
room
revealing the
440.
terrible nature
Weird
of what was
things
happening
happened
to
there,
me.
Linda. They
A
stopped
bulging
using it as a
leech-like
patient
mouth
room
was
because
wrapped
of it.
around the back of my head,
Linda handed me back
coming
my
down
phone.
to my eyebrows and touching
Let's
each
not
ear.
jump to conclusions.
And its slug-like
Mr.
body
White
ran
was
over my
probably
shoulder and
sleepwalking
into
or
my
having
very
some
soul.
kind of reaction
It was a
to his
parasite,
medication.
and it was
But I
feeding
could
on my
tell she
mind.
was unsettled.
My now adult
Where is he
grandson
now?
held my
I
hand
asked.
as I took in the
They're
horror.
bringing him back up.
After a
Dr.
moment, he
Sharma's
asked,
on his way in to examine
Removing
him.
it is going to hurt very
She
badly.
paused.
Are
The
you up
rest
for
of
this?
the night was thankfully
Fearful, I
uneventful.
asked. Is
Mr.
Mar
White
here?
was settled into room
His face softened.
439. and
Number
seemed
not for a
fine,
few years now.
if a bit confused
I could
about
tell
what
from
had
his
happened.
reaction what had
Dr.
happened.
Sharma chalked
I didn't
it up
want it
to
to
a
be true.
combination of fever
How?
and new medication.
We have this
Around
conversation
5
a lot.
I was
He
helping
responded.
a patient in room 435
Are you sure you want to know?
when my phone buzzed.
It never makes you feel
It was
better.
a text from Linda.
Tears brimmed
Need
in
you
my
at
eyes.
nurse's station ASAP.
Then I don't care if it hurts
When I got there,
or if I die.
she pointed to the
I
security.
don't want to
monitor.
stay in a time where
Watch
she's not
the hallway
alive.
outside
He made a
432.
sympathetic noise of understanding
On the grainy
and then
black
returned to
and
his
white
machines to hook
footage, I could
several
see the
wires,
hallway was empty.
diodes, and
Then
other
a
bits
dark
of technology
figure
to my
walked into
limbs and
frame.
forehead.
It looked like a man
While he
in
did
a
so,
white coat,
he talked.
but something about his movements
I've worked
was
for 2
off.
decades to figure
Jerky,
this out,
unnatural,
and I've had a ton of
like
help
Mr.
from
White
other
had been in
researchers
my
of the occult.
hallucination.
This parasite doesn't
The
technically
figure
exist
stopped
in our
outside
plane.
room 432,
It's one of the lesser spawns
Mrs.
of mu
Peterson's
beta
room,
mu,
and seemed
and
to
it feeds
stare
on the
directly
plexus
at
of
the
mind,
camera before
soul,
disappearing into the
and
room.
quantum consciousness brought a
That's
reality.
not any of our doctors,
When details like
Linda
names
said.
and colors
I
of
called
objects
security.
changed,
They're
you weren't
reviewing
going
the
crazy.
footage.
The web
I
of your
felt my blood
existence was
run
merely
cold.
losing strands
We
as
need
the
to
creature
check on
ate
Mrs.
its way through
Peterson.
you. I didn't
We
fully
rushed to
understand.
room 432
I looked up
together.
in confusion as he
Mrs.
placed a
Peterson was
circlet
awake,
of
looking
electronics,
frightened.
like a crown on my
There
head,
was a doctor,
in exact
she
line
said as
with
soon
where
as
the
we
parasite's mouth
He
had ringed
came
me.
in and stood at the foot of my
What's
bed.
mu beta mu?
Just
He paused his
staring at
work
me.
and grew
When I
pale.
asked what he wanted,
I
he said
forgot
he
that
was
you
looking
wouldn't
for
know.
someone who belonged
You're
in
lucky,
the old
believe me.
room. I told him
After
I
a
didn't
deep
know
breath,
what he was talking
he began
about,
moving
and
again
left.
and placed
What did
his
he look
fingers
like?
near a few
I asked,
switches.
dreading the
Ready?
answer. Tall,
This is carefully
thin,
tuned to make
older
your nervous
gentleman.
system
I
extremely
couldn't see his
unappetizing
face
to the
clearly,
parasite,
but his eyes.
but it's basically electroshock
shuddered.
therapy.
His eyes were
I
strange.
could still see
like
Mars
they were
smile,
all black.
even though she was dead.
Linda and
I'd just been with her
exchanged
moments ago.
Did you happen
Do
to
it.
get his name?
The click of a
Linda
switch
asked.
echoed in my ears,
Mrs.
and I
Peterson
almost
nodded.
laughed at how mild
He
the
called
electricity
himself
was.
Doctor.
It didn't feel like
Marsh.
anything,
The
at
day
least at
shift came
first.
in at 7 a.m.
Then,
and I've never been
I
so
saw the
glad
mirror
to see my
shaking,
replacement.
and my body
Linda
within
and
that
I
image
stayed an
convulsing.
extra hour to brief
Oh,
security about
number.
what had happened.
It did
They were
hurt.
taking it seriously.
Nothing had ever been more
reviewing all
painful.
the camera footage
It
from
was just so
overnight.
excruciating
Instead of
that
going
my
home
mind
to
hadn't
sleep,
been able
I
to
went
immediately
the local
process it.
library.
As my vision shook and fire burned in every nerve in my body, I could see the reflected trembling light silhouette of the parasite on my head as it writhed in agony equal to mine. It had claws, 6 clawed, lizard-like limbs under its leech-like body, and it cut into me in an attempt to stay latched on. The electricity made my memories flare. Mar's smile was foremost, lit brightly in front of a warm fire as the snow fell past the window behind her. The edges of that memory began lighting up, and I realized that my life was one continuous stretch of experience. It was only the awareness of it that had been fragmented by that feasting evil on my back. I'd never managed to be there for the birth of my son. I jumped around it a dozen times, but never actually lived it. For the first time, I got to hold Mar's hand and be there for her. Number no. That moment shifted seamlessly into holding her hand as she lay in a hospital bed for a very different reason. Not this. God. Why? It was so merciless to make me remember this. I broke down in tears as nurses rushed into the room. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to experience it. I'd seen all the good parts, but I hadn't wanted the worst part, the inevitable end that all would one day face. It wasn't worth it. It was tainted. All that joy was given back 10,000-fold as pain. The fire in my body and in my brain surged to sheer white torture, and I screamed. My scream faded into a surprised shout as the machines and electricity and chair faded away. Snow was no longer falling around my life. I was out in the woods on a bright summer day. Oh, God. I turned to see the creature approaching me. It was the same absence of meaning, the same blank on reality. It crept forward, just like before, but this time it hissed and turned away. I stood, astounded at being young again and freed from the parasite. My grandson had actually done it. He'd made me an unappetizing meal, so the predator of mind and soul had moved on in search of a different snack. I returned home in a daze, and while I was sitting there, processing all that had happened, the phone rang. I looked at it in awe and sadness. I knew who it was. It was Marjorie, calling for the first time for some trivial reason she'd admit 30 years later was made up just to talk to me. But all I could see was her lying in that hospital bed dying. It was going to end in unspeakable pain and loneliness. I would become an old man, left to sit by myself in an empty house, his soulmate gone long before him. At the end of it all, the only thing I would have left, sitting and watching the falling snow. But now, thanks to my grandson, I would also have my memories. It would be a wild ride, no matter how it ended.
I don't know. But
on a sudden impulse, I picked up the phone. With a smile, I asked, "Hey, who's this?" Even though I already knew.
Around 3 a.m., I was near downtown Chicago when the temperature suddenly dropped back in 2018. My breath came out in white puffs and the lights flickered. The tips were good. Then I saw Dr. Marsh at the end of the hallway. In the dim light, he looked almost normal except for his eyes. Completely black, like empty space, small bakery. He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked toward the old storage closet. Was old, the former room, probably from the 1920s. Against my better judgment, brick walls, I followed. Dark wooden beams. The door to the storage closet was open, but when I looked inside, I'd been working there for about 6 months when things started getting weird. But even more antiquated than what I'd seen before. That I brushed off as coincidence or my imagination running wild during those late-night shifts. Dr. Marsh stood by the different spots than where I'd left them. What do you want? The temperature would drop suddenly for no reason. My voice shaking. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps upstairs. Up close, what was supposed to be an empty storage area. Too pale. My mannered Tom was this gruff guy in his 50s through frosted glass, running Murphy's for over 20 years. My work. He said. When I mentioned the strange occurrences, his voice echoed strangely. He just laughed it off come and tell me I was spending too much time. I found a way through drunk people, but now I can't get back. Stories. I need a subject, but I noticed someone to help me reverse the process. Like he knew more than he was letting on. I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. The first really unsettling incident happened on a Tuesday night in October. I went too far. Tuesdays were usually dead, especially after midnight. It's like our so I was alone behind the bar with just 3 customers nursing their drinks in different corners of the pub. The old jukebox in the corner had been playing classic rock all evening. They can perceive both sides. It switched to this slow, haunting melody. I need someone to take my place so I can return. The song was completely different from anything else. I can't help you. His expression like it was from the 1940s. You already have. With a woman singing in a language I couldn't identify. Just by acknowledging I walked over to check it out, thinking the light someone had fed at quarters and selected something weird. Dr. Marsh moved, but when I got there, the display showed he was suddenly right in front of me, reaching for my arm. There was no money. His touch was ice cold. The music just kept playing my arm, like getting louder and more distorted. I screamed and pulled away, stumbling backward out of the room. An older guy, as I fell into the hallway, the door slammed looked at me with wide eyes and a security guard came some kind of joke. When they opened the door, I unplugged the jukebox from the wall. But the music didn't stop. Clutching my arm. It kept playing for another full minute. Marsh was finally fading away. The security guard looked skeptical. The three customers left shortly after that. Your leaving me alone, she said, with a machine that had somehow played music without power. Where Dr. Marsh spent the rest of my shift avoiding that corner. The skin red and blistered. When I told Tom about it by extreme cold, he got this look on his face. The hospital administration couldn't ignore what had happened after seeing my arm. Then they brought in a team of investigators who specialized in environmental anomalies. It had checked sentimental value, particularly the old room 4 took over the space. When they removed part of the back wall of the storage closet, they found something about the way the old newspaper had described was a lot more to that story. Inside escalated quickly after the jukebox incident. One journal the next week, I started seeing Marsh's final peripheral vision describing his belief that he had found a way to figure step sideways what looked like into what he called a parallel configuration of reality, where we kept his last entry simply read, "Tonight, every time I turn to get a better look, if successful, I will return with proof." But I could swear the hospital decided to permanently seal off the storage closet, and sometimes I'd smell perfume that didn't match. They also relocated all patients from the East Wing. The other bartenders started noticing things too. To essentially rebuild who worked the weekend shifts, for weeks after the incident, I had nightmares about Dr. Marsh in the mornings. He would always say the same locked it the night before. You opened the door. Who covered Thursday nights? Now part of you said he'd been hearing someone walking around upstairs during the shortly after. But when I couldn't walk those halls anymore without feeling watched. We started comparing notes, turn a corner and catch a glimpse of something in my all of these incidents were happening. A tall figure in a white coat and they seemed to be centered around the back directly at the pub where I'd been seeing the woman. It's been 4 years. That area had always felt a little colder. I work at a different hospital, but now pediatric noticeably frigid, and only day customers would unconsciously avoid sitting at those tables. Even on busy nights when I'm drifting was limited. In that I decided to do some research on the building's history. I feel a cold. The local library had old city records. I'll open my eyes and newspaper archives that went back decades. Figures standing in what I found made my blood rise cold like black voids. The building had indeed housed a bar in the 1940s about a year after I left. They completely in 1947 a young woman changing the layout so that there's no longer any space where Room 440 used to be. According to the newspaper articles I found, Eleanor was a regular at the Blue. She says things have been normal since the renovation, but she was a secretary downtown. And I don't know if what happened was real or if we somehow all got caught up on some kind of mass hallucination. She'd been at the bar as but usual, I do know sitting in her favorite spot. Something was wrong and listening to music. Something connected to whatever Dr. Marsh remembered her selecting the same song over and sometimes some foreign still feel like she said reminded her of her grandmother. The details of her murder were disturbing. She'd been found never told morning by the cleaning lady, slumped over her table in that back corner. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious wounds, and no witnesses. As Dr. Marsh said, the coroner's report was inconclusive. They couldn't determine the cause of death. The case went cold in the old hospital, and the Blue Moon Lounge closed permanently not long after. Reading about Eleanor's death sent chills down my spine. Don't ignore it, especially when I realized that her favorite table was in the exact spot where I'd been seeing the mysterious. And if you ever see a doctor with eyes like the song she'd been playing on the jukebox the night she died matched the description of the haunting melody I'd heard. And most importantly, don't let everything was starting to make a because some doors, once opened, I brought my very hard to close again, hoping he'd finally level with me about what was going on.
Story
he read
3.
Through the newspaper. I'll try to keep this short, but there's a lot to unpack. Then sat back in his chair. Last month I was house sitting for my aunt after a long she went on vacation to Europe. That he'd known it's this big old house on the outskirts of town that's been in our family for decades. When he bought the kind of place with too many renovated weird angles everywhere. Atmosphere would put I'd stayed there before when I was younger, so I knew
She's
my
never
way
heard
around
anyone,
pretty well.
Tom
The
said,
thing about
his
this
voice
house is
barely
that
above
there's
a
this
whisper.
basement door
In all the
in the kitchen
years I've
that's
been
always
here,
been locked.
she's never done
I mean
anything
always.
truly
dangerous. Like, for as long as I can
reminders that she's
when I was
still
a
around.
kid, I asked my
figured
aunt
as long
about
as
it
we
once,
left
and
her
she
alone,
just said it was
she'd
storage
leave us
and that
alone.
the stairs were too old
But
and
Tom was
dangerous to
wrong.
use. Eleanor wasn't
Fair
content
enough.
to just
I
coexist
never really
with us
thought about
anymore.
it much after that.
So I'm house sitting,
and her
and everything's
was
going
becoming
fine
more
for the first
aggressive
few
and harder
days.
to ignore.
I'm working from home during the day,
Saturday
watching
night,
Netflix at night.
The
just
pub was
enjoying
packed
having
with
the
the
whole
usual
place to
weekend
myself.
crowd.
But on
College
college
students,
students,
young
young
professionals,
professionals, couples
I was
on
in the
dates,
kitchen making a late
the
dinner
atmosphere
when I heard
was
this
lively
sound.
and loud.
It was
like someone
conversations
walking
and
around
laughter
drowning
downstairs.
out the background
Not
music.
footsteps exactly.
I was behind the
More
bar,
like
mixing
shuffling
drinks,
or dragging
chatting
something
with
across
customers.
the floor.
When the temperature
At
in
first
the
I
pub
thought it might
suddenly
just be the house
plummeted.
settling, or
It
maybe
wasn't
a
a gradual
gradual
change,
change,
but it kept
it
going
was like
for
someone
10
had opened
minutes.
a massive
I
freezer
stood
door,
there listening,
within
trying
seconds,
to figure out what
everyone's
it could be.
breath was visible
The sound
in the
was
air.
definitely
Conversation
below the
stopped
kitchen,
mid-sentence
which would be
as
the
people
basement,
looked around
but that
and
didn't make
confusing,
sense because the
pulling their
basement was
jackets
supposed to
tighter
be
and
locked up
asking
and
if the
the
heat
heat
had
broken.
After a
But
while,
this
the
wasn't a
noise
mechanical
stopped.
failure.
I finished
This was
making my
something else
food and
entirely.
tried to forget about
The
it,
lights
but I
began
kept glancing
flickering.
at that
Casting
casting
door.
eerie
It
shadows
looked
that
the
danced
same as
across the
always.
walls.
Old
The
white
jukebox,
paint that
which
was
had been
peeling in
playing
some
normally
spots,
all evening,
with this ancient
suddenly
looking
switched
brass
to that
doorknob
same
that had
haunting
probably
melody
been there
I'd
since
heard
the
weeks earlier.
1960s.
But
The
this
next
time,
night it happened
was much
again.
louder,
Same
drowning out
shuffling
every
sound,
other sound in
same
the pub.
general area.
Some
This time
customers
I
covered
actually
their
walked
ears
over
and
to the
started heading
basement
for the
door and
door.
pressed my
Then I
ear
saw her
against it.
clearly for the first time.
I could definitely hear
Eleanor
something
was
moving
standing
around
down
that
there.
corner.
No
It sounded
longer
like
just a
someone was
glimpse of my
rearranging
peripheral
furniture or
vision.
maybe boxes.
She was wearing a
I tried the
navy blue
door
dress
knob,
with a white
even though I
collar.
knew it would be
Her
locked.
dark hair styled
It
in
was.
victory rolls typical of
I
the
shook it a few
1940s.
times, but the door was
Her
solid.
skin was
Whatever
pale,
was happening
almost
down
translucent.
there, I couldn't get to
and
it
her
from this
eyes were
entrance.
fixed directly
That's
on
when
me.
I remembered there
She
might be
looked
another way
exactly
in.
like the photograph
The house
I
has an
found in the
outdoor
old
entrance to the
newspaper
basement,
article about
one
one
of
of
those
those angled
But
cellar
what
doors
terrified
you see
me
on
wasn't
old
her
houses.
appearance.
It
I'd
was
never
the
paid
expression
attention
on
to
her
it
face.
before, but I
She
figured
looked
it was
angry,
worth checking
desperate,
out.
and deeply
I grabbed
sad
the
all at
flashlight
once.
and went outside.
Her mouth was moving
The
as
cellar
if she
door
was
was
trying
around
to
the
say
back of
something,
the house,
but no
partially
sound
hidden
was
by
coming
some
out over the
overgrown
deafening
bushes.
music from the
When I got
jukebox.
close to it,
The
I
other
noticed
customers
something
were
that
starting
made my
to
stomach
panic.
drop.
Some were
The
pushing
padlock
toward
that
the
should have
exit,
been
while
securing
others
it
stood
was
lying
frozen
on
in
the
place,
ground,
staring at
clinging
Eleanor
through.
in shock and
The door was
disbelief.
slightly open.
A woman
I stood
at the
there
bar
staring
next to me
at her
grabbed
for a
my
good
arm
5
and
minutes,
asked in a
trying
shaking
to
voice
decide
if I
what
was
to do.
seeing what she was seeing.
Every instinct I
could
had
only
was
nod,
telling me to go
unable
back
to find
inside
my
and
voice.
call my aunt.
Eleanor
or
raised her
maybe
hand
even
and
the
pointed
police.
directly at me.
But another part
Her
of me
mouth
was
still
curious.
moving silently.
If
The
someone was
jukebox
breaking
music
into
grew
the
even
basement,
louder.
shouldn't I
The
find
lights
out who
flickered
and
more
why?
violently.
I
and
opened the
several
cellar
glasses
door
behind
wider
the bar
and shined
shattered
my flashlight down the
simultaneously.
stairs.
That's
They
when
were
the screaming
concrete
started
and looked sturdy
People were
enough,
trampling
despite
over
what
each
my
other to
aunt
get
had
out of the
said
pub.
about them being
Chairs
dangerous.
were overturned.
I could see
Drinks
the bottom
were
of the
spilled,
staircase,
and
and
within
what looked
minutes
like a
the place
typical
was nearly
unfinished
empty
basement.
except for
Concrete
me,
floor,
Eleanor, and a
exposed
handful of
beams,
customers
that kind of
who
thing.
seemed too stunned
I
to
went
move.
down.
I
The
stood
basement
there
was
behind
bigger
the
than I
bar,
expected.
my heart pounding
There were a
so
few
hard,
pieces of
I
old
thought it might
furniture
burst,
covered with sheets,
trying to understand
some cardboard
what Eleanor
boxes
wanted
stacked
from me.
against the walls,
Then, as
and
suddenly
an
as
old
it had
water
started,
heater in the corner.
everything stopped.
Nothing looked
The
disturbed
music
or
cut
out of
off.
place.
The lights
No
steadied,
signs that
and the
anyone had
temperature
been down
returned
there
to
recently.
normal.
But then I
Eleanor was
noticed
gone.
something odd.
The only evidence
There
of
was
what
a
had
clear
happened was the
path
broken
through the
glass
dust
behind
on
the
the
bar,
floor,
and the
like someone
overturned
had been
furniture
walking the
scattered
same
throughout
route
the
over
pub.
and over again.
I called
The
Tom
path led
immediately.
from the bottom
my
of the
hands
stairs
shaking
to
so
the far
badly I could
wall,
barely
where I
dial
could
his
see
number.
the other staircase
He arrived
that led
within
up to
20
the
minutes.
kitchen door.
Took one
I
look
followed
at
the
the chaos
path
and
and
closed
closed
the
something
pub
that made
for the
my
rest of
blood
the
run
night.
cold.
We spent the
At
next
the base
hour
of the
cleaning
stairs
up and
leading
trying
to
to
the
make
kitchen,
sense of
there
what
was
had
a
happened.
small pile of
She's
what
getting
looked like
stronger,
food crumbs.
Tom said as we swept up the
Fresh
broken
glass.
glass.
This is the
And
worst
next
it's
to
ever
them,
been.
a plastic
Something's
water bottle
changed,
that was still
and I don't
half
think
full.
ignoring her is going to work
Someone had been
anymore.
coming down here regularly.
The next few days were tense. I was about to head
Word
back
about the
upstairs
incident
when I
had
heard
spread
the kitchen
quickly
door
through the
creak
neighborhood,
open above me,
and some of our
Footsteps
regular
on the
customers
stairs
were too spooked to come
slow,
back.
deliberate
The local
footsteps
newspaper
coming down
even ran a
toward me.
small article
I
about
panicked.
the
There was nowhere to
disturbance at
hide in the
Murphy.
basement. It was
Though
too
they
open,
attributed
too
it
empty.
to a gas leak
I turned
that
off my
caused
flashlight and
hallucinations.
crouched behind one of
Tom
the
went
covered
along
pieces
with
of
that story
furniture,
publicly,
trying
but
to make
privately,
myself as
we
small
both
as
knew
possible.
the truth was
The
far
footsteps
stranger.
reached the bottom
I
of the
started
stairs.
having dreams about
In the
Eleanor.
darkness,
I could barely make out a
figure
figure
in my
moving
bedroom
around the basement,
standing at the foot
They
of
had
my
their
bed
own
with that
flashlight,
same desperate
and I
expression.
watched the beam dance
She would try
across
to
the
speak,
walls as they
but her
moved.
voice was always
The beam
just out of
stopped on the
reach,
pile of
like
crumbs
hearing
where I'd
someone
been
whisper
standing
from
just
another
moments
room.
before.
I would
I
wake
held
up
my breath,
exhausted
trying
and
not to
anxious,
make any noise.
dreading another shift.
The
at the
figure
pub
stood there
for
for
what
what
felt
felt
like
like hours,
but
despite
was
everything that had
probably
happened.
I felt
Then
a
they
strange
started
sense
moving
of
again,
responsibility,
but not back up the
Eleanor
stairs.
had chosen to reveal
They were
herself
walking
to
toward
me
my
more
hiding
than
spot.
anyone else.
The flashlight beam got
She
closer
pointed
and
at me
closer.
during that chaotic
I could hear
Saturday
the
night.
footsteps
There was
right next to
something
me
she
now.
wanted me to understand.
I closed my eyes
and I couldn't
waited
shake
for
the
them to
feeling
find
that walking away
but then
would
the
only
footsteps
make things
moved away.
worse.
I opened my eyes and saw the light directing toward the cellar door. It sounds crazy now, but at the time, I waited until I heard the only logical talk before I moved. I started staying over to where the figure had been sitting alone in the empty pub and trying to sense her presence. Exactly where I would talk out loud was a fresh apple that I knew her empty sandwich and asking what she wanted. This person wasn't just breaking into the basement. They were living. But on the fourth night, I got out of there as fast as I could, a beer, running up the cellar door stairs and back into the house. I felt that familiar drop. I locked every door and window I could find and called the police immediately, like she was materializing.
When they arrived, they
shadows
searched the entire
corner.
house and basement,
This time
but found
she
nothing.
looked calmer,
No
less
signs of
agitated
forced
than
entry
before.
from inside.
She walked slowly
No
toward the
evidence
bar,
that
and I
anyone
forced
had been
myself
living
to
in
stay
the basement.
seated and not run.
The officer said
When
it
she was
was
about
possible
10
that a
feet away,
transient
she
had been
stopped
used
and
in
looked
the
directly
basement
into my
temporarily
eyes and had moved Her on. mouth moved, but this time I could hear her voice. When the police checked the kitchen door like an old radio transmission through static from the inside. Find the keyhole showed no signs of tampering. And my aunt covered had the only key with her in Europe. Find. So how had someone been getting from the basement into the kitchen? Before I could respond, she faded away. And more importantly, with more questions, if that door was locked from the inside, but at least now how had they gotten out? Eleanor wasn't just my aunt the next day and told her what happened. She wanted someone to uncover the real story, then went quiet for a long time. I threw myself into research with renewed determination. I spent hours in the library, combing through police records. My brother lived in that basement for 3 years back in the 1947. After he came back from Vietnam, he couldn't handle being around most of the official records. He'd only come upstairs late at night to get food. We had to install that lock because he wouldn't stop wandering through the house. An elderly librarian. What happened to Mrs. Patterson remembered another long and mentioned that her late husband died down police officer at the time. Heart attack. She still had found him at the bottom of those stairs a week later attic, and she moved out the next day through them. I don't care if that makes me everything I thought I knew. My aunt never mentioned anything about needing according to Officer Patterson, she got back from her trip. Eleanor hadn't, but she did mention that the cellar door padlock was found unlocked with the married city council, and there were fresh crumbs on the basement stairs. Hayes was a prominent figure. Houses keep their secrets, with aspirations for higher office. Secrets are buried, a reputation to protect. When Eleanor threatened to expose their relationship, he'd apparently decided to silence. This happened about 3 months ago. The night of her death, staying at my Hayes had met Eleanor at the Blue Moon while he was out of town for Officer Patterson's notes suggested that Hayes had poisoned Eleanor's drink with something that would cause cardiac arrest, exposed a method that would be difficult to detect with the forensic technology available in 1947 at the time. So crashing Hayes had connections throughout the police department and city government, this long and he used his influence to ensure that the investigation was quietly dropped. Long. Eleanor had been murdered not by a random stranger, but by someone she trusted. About halfway down the hall, had used her feelings for him to lure mirror to her down the left wall. The injustice of it all made me sick to my stomach, and has this. But it also gave me a sense that looks like it came from some. She'd been trying to tell someone the truth for over 70 years, and couldn't resist buying someone even though it barely fit. The problem was that Robert Hayes had died in 1983. Taking his secrets with him to the grave, watched his Netflix. There was no legal recourse, standard house sitting to justice. But on the third night, I realized that wasn't necessarily what I have this habit of getting up around 2 or 3 to know the truth, to acknowledge what I'm really happened to her. And once I'm the next night, I returned to the pub after closing and sat in Eleanor's favorite spot in the back corner. Started walking down the hall. I brought Officer Patterson's notes with me, and as I passed the mirror, I caught a glimpse of my reflection about Robert Hayes and the cover-up. Nothing unusual about that, except my reflection wasn't moving at the same time. But this time she looked different. I stopped dead in my desperation were gone from the mirror. My reflection by something that looked like relief, but it was like watching a delayed. She stood listening as I told her every movement I made, nodding occasionally. My reflection as if confirming details I'd gotten right. Raised my hand. When I finished reading, and a beat later, she smiled. My reflection, the first time I'd seen any expression other than sadness, and my reflection would turn its head a moment. She walked closer to me. I stood there. I could see tears on her cheeks, moving different parts of my body and watching my reflection lag behind each time. But this time was different. It was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. The oppressive cold that had always accompanied her presence to see if I could confuse it somehow. The back corner, which had been frigid for months, warmed to match the rest of the room. Myself, I was the jukebox, which had been acting erratically for weeks, went completely silent and stayed that way. Especially in dim. Eleanor was gone, and this time I knew she wasn't coming back. I wrote up everything I discovered and gave copies to Tom. The next Patterson, I tanned the local historical society. It wasn't much, but it was something normal. Eleanor's story would be part of the official record now, reflections, even if justice had come 70 years too late. I felt pretty stupid for freaking out over what was obviously just my imagination. The strange incident stopped completely, but that night the pub felt lighter somehow. This time a weight was more lifted from the entire building, more alert. Customers gradually down the hall, drawn by the comfortable atmosphere, and sure enough, drinks. There was that same unaware that they were now sharing the space. But this time, I noticed something else. I continued working at Murphy's for another year. When I smiled, eventually my reflection didn't smile back. When I frowned, I'll never forget my reflection stayed neutral. Or the woman who trusted me with her stories. But not my facial expressions. Eleanor and wonder if she found different expressions. Finally being raised eyebrows, sticking out my tongue, even making weird faces at her death. My reflection would mimic the movement of my head and the general gesture, but the facial expression was always just this blank, neutral stare. Lost in the haze after a few minutes of this, I got really uncomfortable, but and headed back to the couch. Especially as I was walking away, I looked over my shoulder 7 decades to tell my reflection was still there. The building that houses Murphy's Irish pub is still there. It was standing in the Chicago street, arms at its sides. Tom retired just watching me go, and new management took over. But the place maintains. I called Jake to ask about the new atmosphere. I tried to sound casual about it, just mentioning that it was a though it only plays the songs that are actually programmed into it now. He told me it came if you ever find yourself there on a Victorian Tuesdays across town, take a look at the back corner where the extra chairs are stacked. Everything. It's warmer there. Did the previous welcome mention instead of weird about it? Sometimes I like to think that Eleanor's presence didn't entirely disappear. It's just a that she just transformed from a tormented spirit into something more benevolent, watching over the place where she spent her final living moments. The truth about her death may have taken decades to surface. But that night, I decided to avoid the hallway altogether. Sometimes I used a water bottle instead of going to the bathroom and made sure to stay in the living room lost to time. But around 3 a.m., I heard something that made my blood freeze. Footsteps in the hallway, covered up by people slow, deliberate footsteps going back and forth. But she wasn't forgotten. I muted her story, listened carefully. Passed down. The footsteps would start from one end of the hall and walk to the other end. Pause for a few seconds, then walk back. Dig deep. This went on for at least 10 minutes. That's the real horror of what happened at Murphy's. Those footsteps sounded exactly like supernatural phenomena. Same weight, but the very human evil that created squeak on the third floorboard. The experience taught me that sometimes the dead aren't trying to scare Jake's closet and they're trying to communicate something important. As I got closer, the footsteps Eleanor's haunting wasn't random. I peered around the corner and saw purposeful. She was trying to tell her story. Somehow it felt like someone had just been there. Hoping that eventually someone would care enough to seek out the truth. In the reflection, I could see the entire hallway behind me, though I've never encountered anything quite like what happened. Everything looked normal, but the experience made me a better listener, more attuned to the stories that people carry with them. Everyone who sits at a bar has a story to tell, and most of them just want someone to listen without judgment. Eleanor's story was darker than most, involving betrayal, murder, and corruption that reached into the highest levels of local government. But at its core, it was the story of a young woman who fell in love with the wrong person and paid the ultimate price. I told him I'd found another place to stay. She deserved better than she got in life, and she deserved to have her story told truthfully. And I just said the long commute to work, the paranormal incidents at Murphy's were real. To tell him about. I'm certain of that. What would I even say? Too many people that his antique mirror was somehow showing a different version of reality. But the true horror wasn't started living its own life. It was in the very ordinary human capacity for evil that had created the situation because it was giving him weird. Robert Hayes was probably a charming man who knew how to manipulate people's emotions for his own gain. He likely convinced Eleanor that he loved her, that he would leave his wife for her, that they had a future together. When she became inconvenient, he eliminated her with the same calculated coldness that he probably applied to his political career. The cover-up that followed her death was equally disturbing. Multiple people had to have been involved in suppressing the investigation, from police officers to city officials to newspaper editors. Eleanor's life was considered expendable compared to Hayes' political ambitions and the reputation of the city government. That kind of corruption still exists today, though hopefully not to the same extent. People in power still sometimes believe they can make inconvenient problems disappear. whether through legal manipulation,
a week later.
financial
He says
influence,
his apartment
or
feels
simply
normal
waiting
again,
for public
and he's
attention to
sleeping
move
better.
elsewhere.
Sometimes I wonder
Eleanor's
about
story
whoever
is a
bought it,
reminder
whether
that
they're
sometimes those
experiencing the same
problems
things
don't
we
stay
do.
buried,
But mostly,
that
I
truth
try not to think
has a way
about
of
it,
surfacing
because every now
even
and then,
decades
when
later.
I'm walking past
The most
mirrors in my
disturbing
own
aspect
place,
of the whole
I catch
experience
myself checking to
was
make sure my
realizing
reflection
how
is doing
close
exactly
Eleanor's
what I'm
story
doing.
came to being lost
So
forever.
far, it always
If
is,
Tom had
but
been
that
more
half second of
successful
doubt
in
never
ignoring
goes
the
away.
supernatural incidents, if I hadn't been curious enough to research the building's history, if Mrs. Patterson hadn't kept her husband's old files, any of those factors could have changed the outcome entirely. How many other stories like Eleanor's are out there, locked away in old buildings or forgotten in dusty archives? How many people died under suspicious circumstances, only to have their cases buried by people with the power and influence to rewrite history? The thought keeps me awake sometimes, wondering about all the untold stories of injustice that will never see the light of day. But Eleanor's story did surface eventually. Her voice was finally heard, her truth finally acknowledged. That has to count for something, even if it came 70 years too late. Maybe that's all any of us can hope for, that our stories will matter to someone, that we won't be forgotten entirely when we're gone. Working at Murphy's taught me that the line between the living and the dead isn't as clear as we like to think. Eleanor's presence in that pub was as real as any of the customers who came in for drinks and conversation. She had needs and desires just like any living person. She wanted to be heard, to be understood, to have her story told accurately. The supernatural elements of her haunting were just tools she used to get attention, to make people notice that something was wrong. The cold temperatures, the malfunctioning jukebox, the glimpses of her figure in the shadows, all of it was designed to create enough disturbance that someone would eventually ask the right questions. In the end, the real horror story wasn't about a ghost haunting a bar. It was about a young woman whose life was cut short by greed and ambition, whose death was covered up by corrupt officials, and whose story was nearly lost to time. The supernatural elements were just the delivery method for a very human tale of betrayal and injustice. Eleanor Hartwell deserved better than she got in life, but at least her story finally got the ending it deserved. Someone listened, someone cared enough to dig for the truth, and someone made sure that her memory wouldn't be lost. That's not the same as justice, but sometimes acknowledgement is the closest thing to justice that we can achieve. If you ever find yourself in a place that feels haunted, remember that there might be a story behind the supernatural incidents. Someone might be trying to communicate something important, something that got buried along with their body. The real horror often lies not in the ghostly encounters themselves, but in the very human events that created them. Eleanor's story is finally told, her truth finally acknowledged. The back corner of Murphy's Irish pub is warm and welcoming now, no longer carrying the weight of unresolved injustice. But her memory lives on in the historical record, a reminder that every life has value and every story deserves to be heard, even if it takes 7 decades for someone to listen.